Hello everyone and welcome to today's lecture. For today we are continuing in Intersectionality and Intervention Part 2. So if you have not seen Part 1, which is Intersectionality and Intervention as well, that goes over Kimberlé Crenshaw's reading, make sure you go back and watch that lecture so that way you're able to place this lecture in its proper context. So with that being stated, let's go ahead and jump in and get into our roadmap so that way we know exactly what it is we will be looking at. We're going to begin with our flashback, then we're going to transition over into key terms, and then we're going to look at organizing in feminist spaces, followed by Black public policy and communal spaces. That will be followed by of rights and dispossession, and then we are going to end by taking another look at intersectionality. So with that being stated, let's go ahead and jump into our flashback. First, we're going to begin by looking at de jure and de facto. This is a term that we have looked at repeatedly in this course, and the reason why we have done that is that because critical race theory and indeed critical race feminism really explores the difference between the two. So again, de jure is what? Law as it is written. And de facto is law as it is what? Lived or experienced or by a social custom. So what critical race theory and critical race feminism are going to do is they're going to say, look, this law is on the books that, these rights should be acknowledged. However, that's not happening in society. And what critical race theory is going to do along with critical race feminism is it is going to explore why is that happening and what are the mechanisms by which that is taking place. Now, along those lines, this is exactly what Kimberlé Crenshaw is doing in her piece that we are reading to understand the intervention that intersectionality is making within the larger discourse of critical race theory. And toward that end, to make her point, she looks at three cases. And what is important is that she's not cherry picking these cases, right? She's looking at these cases to say, hey, this is pattern in practice of a larger phenomenon that is happening in society. I'm just looking at these three cases to make the point. And what are those cases? Those cases are DeCaffrey Reed versus General Motors, Moore versus Hughes Helicopter Incorporated, and Payne versus Travenol. And in each one of these cases, Black women are having a particular experience by way of what? Law. In the decisions that judges are making. Remember that if it's critical race theory or critical race feminism, it has to engage what? Law. So accordingly, Kimberlé Crenshaw is looking at these cases and again, making the point that this is pattern and practice of what is happening to Black women. And therefore, it has significant implications for Title VII claims, 14th Amendment right claims, as well as disparate impact claims. And accordingly, when these harms and injuries and non-cognizability of Black women take place via these cases, again, go back to the previous lecture, week 3, lecture 3, to understand what it is I'm talking about. But when harms come about such that as happened in these cases, what becomes clear is that the convergence of race, gender, and neoliberalism comes to be a problem in the lives of Black women, particularly when law is involved. And to know more about neoliberalism and what it is and the examples we laid out, what you will want to look at is week 3, lecture 1. So that way you understand exactly what it is we are talking about. After we went through that, then we looked at intersectionality. And we unpacked that intersectionality is not just the multiplicity of identities, right? But it is how institutions and social structures causes those identities to matter. So it's not just enough to say, okay, I'm Black and man, or I'm white and woman, etc. That is an intersectional identity. But the other part of that is how social institutions causes those identities to matter. So by way of that flashback, let's go ahead and jump into our key terms, which will look familiar from the previous lecture, but it is important that we recover these terms and put them back into our memory bank. And those terms are but for, as well as protected classes. Let's begin with the protected classes. What are those classes which are protected by law that have been historically marginalized and excluded from society via law and public policy? Those protected classes are race, color, sex, pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, age, disability, and genetic information, i.e. your family medical history. And again, this obviously has implications for insurance companies, but that folks within these particular classes should be protected. But what Kimberlé Crenshaw's piece makes clear is that these protections are not extended for into black women. Again, go back to the first part of this lecture. That's week 3, lecture 3, so that you can understand how she gets to that argument. Then the other key term that you will need to understand for today is but for. And that is really going to apply over the examples that we are going to be looking at. And again, what but for is it is a legal standard that simply says that but for a particular thing, which is usually a social identity, the normative course of action for a specific thing would have taken place, right? So then placing the but for standard in context with Kimberlé Crenshaw's reading and what we have studied so far to this point in this course, the standard would be applied in this way. And remember, we're thinking through a critical race feminist lens. It would say something like this: but for black men being black, they too would have access to the reins of power in likeness to white men. What is another example? But for white women being women, they too would have access to the reins of power in likeness to white men. Do you see what's happening there? It's about guaranteeing those 14th Amendment rights, the Title VII protections for these classes via a what? What would Kimberlé Crenshaw say? A single axis analysis, right? That but for those things, then the normative course of actions, rights, etc. would take place in law, and that it would be recognized. So then what becomes of black women who occupy both social monarchies that are rejected by those who are otherwise privileged by way of a single axis analysis, i.e. black men and white women? What do we do with that? Because black women occupy both identities that are rejected in order to convey rights to those groups, right? So as we're thinking through that, and it's an important question to think through, we have to really consider the points that Kimberlé Crenshaw is underscoring, right? And so now that we're in the second part of reading her piece, to underscore her point that black women are experiencing a particular injury by way of law, she revisits several instances wherein black women's voices have been excluded in both black social movement spaces as well as white feminist spaces. Now you see where this but for argument is going to be applied here, and where black women really occupy that chasm that's in between. Again, de facto, de jure, de facto. Right? So the point that Kimberlé Crenshaw is getting at is that when we think through and about black movements and black organizing, as well as thinking about feminist organizing, considering black women should be more than the typical, oh, well, black women should be included too. Well, that's important, but that's not really her point, because what that would do is simply do what? Expand the nation state. And the harms that the nation state does what? Superimposes, right? So, because including anyone in an inherently harmful framework and/or ideology perpetuates the same problems that one would be presumably organizing to challenge, right? Then we got to think differently. And what this brings to mind is someone like a Martin Luther King, who, while reflecting on the movement, right, toward the end of his life, what does he say? He says that he fears that he has integrated his people into a what? A burning house. That expanding the nation state with the way the law is composed, it's not really the direction that we should be going in. That is the point that he is getting at, and that is certainly the point that Kimberlé Crenshaw is underscoring as well. So then the point of taking the experiences of black women seriously is that their lived experiences challenge our existing frameworks and modes of possibility, both within movement spaces specifically and the nation more broadly. What does this sound like? This sounds like week 1. the fourth point in critical. Make sure you go back to week 1, lecture 1, when we broke down literally the words critical race and theory. That is exactly that fourth point of critiquing and challenging dominant frameworks. This is what Kimberlé Crenshaw is getting at, that considering the lived experiences of black women requires that we rethink law in its operation in society, right? But along those lines, let's take a look at 2 instances which Kimberlé Crenshaw highlights, and then we're going to consider some contemporary examples to underscore Kimberlé Crenshaw's point. That is, we're going to bring it to today and make it applicable, right? So that you can see what she is getting at. So, in the second part of the text that you were supposed to read for today, Kimberlé Crenshaw revisits Sojourner Truth's speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" Most of us know that speech. If not, look it up, right? So, in either case, Sojourner Truth's repetitive use of the phrase, "Ain't I a woman?" in front of an audience of white women who did not want her to speak. If you remember the context of that speech, right? If you don't remember the context, make sure you look it up, or if you don't know it, look it up. That's okay, right? So she's in front of this audience of white women who don't want her to speak. And because she is speaking in spite of, it really unveils a few things, right? But we're only going to look at about 2 of them. The first thing that it reveals is that white women wanted Sojourner Truth to be silenced because, as Kimberlé Crenshaw argues and makes clear, they were concerned that she would divert attention from white women getting access to the vote to abolition and emancipation. What does that sound like? The first wave of feminism. Do you see how this is connecting now? When we look, and this comes from week 3, lecture 2, when we looked at the Combahee River collective statement, and we walked through the waves of feminism. So even in this moment, in each moment of those waves that we looked at, we were able to lay out how black women were not acknowledged in those waves. And here we have a tangible example of that. That the white women that Sojourner Truth is speaking in front of, they were more concerned that allowing her to speak would take away the mission they were trying to do in petitioning white men to get the right to access to vote, and that would divert their attention over to abolition and emancipation. Now, why is this important, right? And we want to place some context around this, because important to note is that this speech was given, Sojourner Truth's speech was given in Ohio in 1851 during a 2-day women's rights convention. So here we have a speech that's all of 3 to 4 minutes over a 2-day conference, and they don't want her to speak for those 2 to 4 minutes, right? And white women's efforts to silence Sojourner Truth before she spoke really forces us to reconcile with the reality that, like whiteness, the monarcher of woman also has what? Qualifications. Because to them, their right to vote was more important than Sojourner's right to be what? Free. Are y'all picking up what's being put down here? And that same thing is taking place what? Now. This is what makes organizing in feminist spaces for black women so difficult. So accordingly, as Kimberlé Crenshaw makes clear, white women did not want to sacrifice their what? Their racial privilege, i.e. what? Whiteness as property. Do you all see how all of these weeks are tying in now? Do you see why we had to establish that foundation so that you understand what critical race theory is and what it is arguing before we switch over into understanding critical race feminism, right? So again, what Kimberlé Crenshaw is making clear is that white women did not want to sacrifice their racial privilege to bring about a type of feminist politics that would free everyone. Why? Because they were focused on themselves. So instead, white women in this instance preferred access to the same social rights as their racialized counterpart. What argument's coming in here for? The but for argument. But for them being women, then they would have access to the vote. Do you all see what's happening here? So their answer to Sojourner's question of ain't I a woman was no. Because they believe Sojourner Truth having access to some level of freedom, just some microdium of freedom, was not as important as their right to participate in the nation state at the same level in privilege as white men. In other words, but for them being women, they too would be included. And accordingly, one cannot understand race without gender, and one cannot understand gender without race. That goes back to the E. Francis White argument. Y'all see how this is all connecting? What's the second thing that we can take away from Kimberlé Crenshaw here? And then we're going to move into some contemporary examples and then we'll be done. Secondly, what Sojourner Truth's experience allows us to understand is that as both black women and women of color were advocating for liberation and acknowledgement of specific issues they navigate in everyday life, the structure of feminist organizing spaces permitted white women to speak for women as a group. What might this counter that we talked about in the previous lecture? That sounds like Hughes Helicopter Incorporated now, doesn't it? Whereas in that instance, black women weren't allowed to be representative of the class of women as a class as a whole. But in this instance, we see where white women are allowed to represent for women as a social class as a whole. And due to this, issues impacting those who are not white were and are sidelined. Why? Because white women do not have that lived experience. So then when solutions and policies are crafted in those spaces and they are not intentional about considering in women's of color's experience and black women's experience, that means that the purpose of the policy is simply to reinforce the white hegemonic rule. Y'all see what's happening there? So accordingly, the structure of power itself is not critiqued. But what happens? The expansion of it takes place. The expansion of the nation state power in service of who? White women. Y'all see what's taking place there? Now, that's that on the feminist end. Now we got to put on our seatbelts here, because it might get a little bumpy, but we're going to be all right. So, the same lessons that we see within feminist spaces are also applicable to black communal and organizing spaces, where for many black women and girls, their well-being is not prioritized or of national concern, and specific programs for them are all too often non-existent or not even considered. Right? What am I talking about? Now we're going to go contemporary. We're talking about My Brother's Keeper. That was rolled out by Barack Obama. That was a public-private partnership that said we're going to offer mentorships, right? We're going to offer jobs. We're going to do all this stuff for black men and boys. And ostensibly that is good. But what that suggested was that there was no programming that was needed for black women and girls. Again, when Michelle Obama rolls out her program, it is for the nation. It is not specifically for black women. Excuse me. Because, but for black men being black, they too would be able to take advantage. Do y'all see what's happening here? Right? So within the lens of, and keep in mind, we're talking about My Brother's Keeper here. So within the lens of a patriarchal societal structure, the assumption then becomes so long as black men and boys' concerns are addressed, then the concerns of black women and girls are automatically addressed as well. But this is a very, very powerful yet short-sighted assumption to make, particularly when in many cases, as black men embody what it means to be a man by embracing dominant social views of submissive and obedient women, which oftentimes leads to instances of what? SANDV. Do you all see the moves that is happening here? That by saying, okay, if we take care of black men and boys, then black women and girls are automatically taken care of. Now, furthermore, by focusing on such programming, such as My Brother's Keeper, and there are plenty of examples, I'm just zeroing in on My Brother's Keeper, right? What does it do? It subjects black women and girls' autonomy to black men and boys and thereby affixes a capitalist patriarchal structure in its power to black hands, as opposed to white hands, but leaving the potential for the same harms and injuries in place. This is why understanding Kimberlé Crenshaw's piece is so important. Now, what can we draw out from this? Therefore, a Jeffrey Epstein and a Sean Diddy Combs can exist side by side within the same nation state because there is not a critique of patriarchal power, but rather a struggle over who should have rights to wield said patriarchal power. This is a type of analysis, the incisiveness, the accurateness that critical race feminism is putting down. Do you see why expanding and pushing on the bounds of critical race theory is important, and why having scholars contribute to the field and analyze the field and critique the field is important, right? What else comes up? What else comes up is this type of politics of dressing or communal issues that come up in black spaces. It's a number of things. It can be dressing. It's how black women are ignored. It's how black women are addressed, right? So within the same lens, the issues of black women among black men also abound. Young girls are told what? That they're fast because of the way that they dress and act. And black women are told that they reveal too much and that they do what? Tempt men. In this particular instance, it is the preference and gaze of black men which are centered and never corrected. Hello, somebody, right? That's that uncle, that's that cousin that nobody wants to address and correct. This is where intersectionality comes home. And in many instances, when occurrences of bodily violation take place, black women are seldom believed and black men are protected and advocated for. Meg Thee Stallion is a notable example. And then furthermore, black women and girls are encouraged to do what? Be silenced in favor of what? The rights and recognition and protection of black men. Oh, we got to walk in it today, right? This is the power of understanding intersectionality and what is happening here, right? And this is because within the structure of a patriarchal society, it is the well-being of men that is centered and prioritized. Accordingly, now what is alleged to have taken place with Bill Cosby now becomes not tragic because black women are among the victims, but because Bill Cosby is inconvenienced as a man. Do you all see what's taking place here? In a similar fashion, here we go, hang on. Joe Biden is permitted to silence the voice of Anita Hill, to work with Strom Thurmond and other segregationists in the Senate on slowing desegregation via busing after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, thereby impacting the education and life opportunities of black children who are the children of black women, and he is permitted to pull out of a race at the last minute to hand it to a black woman who herself was also not supported by Barack Obama, a black man, the first black president, until the very last possible moment. And when Kamala Harris subsequently lost the election, somehow in this day and age, she is still expected to do the work of an ungrateful nation who never had any intention on supporting her in the first place, because of the larger patriarchal structure that is present in the nation that we are not critiquing. So it's not just enough to say, I want that power. We have to critique the power. We have to critique the structure and rethink what we want for our political future and its possibilities, right? So this is the harm and the impact of a single axis framework that Kimberlé Crenshaw warns of. Because by the time men have daughters and wives, the damage has already been done to scores of women that they have already encountered. Yet these same men demand respect for their daughters and their wives. Here goes the critical race feminist analysis and critique. Not because it is simple human decency and because his wife and daughters are people, but because it is what is owed to men because they are men, and because that his wife and his daughter are seen as belonging to him, that they be respected because he has done what? He has propertized them. And accordingly, rights and recognition are due him because they are to be seen as extensions of him as opposed to autonomous beings. And herein, the capacity of intersectionality is made clear. Now let's visit of rights and dispossession really quickly so that we can drive this point home, and then we're going to end on intersectionality. So black women often seek to establish, as a result, black women often seek to establish institutions or groups for themselves because their rights are not being recognized, but they are prevented from doing so by way of 14th Amendment lawsuits. Such as the case that happens with the Fearless Fund, when black women, again, establish a venture capitalist fund for black women to be able to get their businesses off the ground, but they are not permitted to do so because white folks file a lawsuit and says, you're violating my rights and my access to whiteness as property. Do you all see what's happening here? It's coming in from all angles. And what this necessitates, again, is that we critique power. So what black women now have to do as a result is organize in spaces in an informal way, such that they can still get the life-sustaining resources that they need to survive in a society that does not recognize their injury, neither in their immediate racialized community or within the larger gendered spaces that they will occupy as women. And accordingly, going back to intersectionality, that all of these identities, what Kimberlé Crenshaw means by intersectionality and what is meant by intersectionality, again, it's not just the multiplicity of identities. It is how social movements, it is how social institutions and social structures causes those identities to matter. We see this in the black church a lot. You can't speak because you're a woman, even though folks like Juanita Bynum, right, and many other preachers as well have broken that ceiling, right? But all too often in cases, we still see where women cannot preach. We even see this in corporate America where women are not permitted to lead. And in those particular ways, those social institutions causes identity to matter, both for refusing rights and both for acknowledging rights. So what then is the lesson to pull from Kimberlé Crenshaw? That we must begin to rethink what we want from society. That there must be a critique of power in and of itself. That white power in black hands is not liberation. But we must rethink what it is we want to do here by challenging and critiquing power itself with an intersectional lens. Because none of this stuff is just happenstance. It doesn't just happen. Someone has to make the decision. The HR manager is making the decision about who gets hired, who gets let go. You, if you're not the HR manager, you might be the immediate manager. And the decisions you make could cause disparate impact, but certainly has implications for intersectionality as well. And that is today's lecture. I will see you in the next one, where we will be discussing the meaning and impact of racism. I'll see you next time. Peace.